Segment: The incident subject. Michael Rockefeller. Date: November 17, 1961. Location: the Arafura Sea, off the coast of Netherlands, New Guinea, now Papua, Indonesia. To understand the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, one must first surrender the modern comfort of connectivity. In 1961, the Asmat region of Netherlands, New Guinea, was not merely a remote corner of the map. It was, for all intents and purposes, the edge of the known world. It was a place where the jungle did not simply grow, it consumed. A landscape of mud, mangroves, and milky brown water that moved with the violent, muscular tides of the Arafura Sea. It is here, against a backdrop of prehistoric humidity and silence, that the 23-year-old heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history found himself stripped of his name, his wealth, and eventually his life. The incident begins not with a dramatic clash, but with a mechanical stutter. On the morning of November 17, 1961, Michael Rockefeller was traveling with Renee Wuzing, a 34-year-old Dutch anthropologist assigned to the government in New Guinea. The two men made for an odd pairing. Rockefeller, the bearded, intense, and driven Harvard graduate seeking to amass a collection of bis poles for his father's Museum of Primitive Art. And Wuzing, the seasoned, pragmatic academic who knew the temperament of the region. They were navigating the coastline in a vessel that could best be described as an act of optimistic improvisation. It was a catamaran, constructed by lashing two local dugout canoes together, powered by an 18-horsepower outboard motor. It was functional, but fragile, a microscopic speck traversing the mouth of the Betsy River, an estuary that bleeds into the open sea. The plan was simple: travel from Agats to the Asmat village of Oostjanup to barter for artifacts. But the Arafura Sea is deceptive. It is shallow, warm, and notoriously turbulent, subject to tides that can shift the water level by nearly 20 feet, creating currents that act less like water and more like a conveyor belt, dragging everything towards the horizon. Mid-morning, November 17, the outboard motor coughed and died. Later investigations would suggest a sheared pin in the drive shaft, or perhaps water in the fuel line. The cause was trivial. The consequence was catastrophic. Without propulsion, the catamaran lost its battle against the current. They were only a few miles from the shore, close enough to see the mangrove line, that thick green wall that separated the liquid world from the solid. But the tide was falling. The water was rushing out of the estuary, pulling the disabled craft away from the safety of the river mouth and out into the open, restless agitation of the Arafura Sea. At first, the situation seemed manageable. They were adrift, yes, but they had supplies. They had the boat. They assumed, with the naive rationality of Westerners, that a passing vessel or a patrol would spot them. But as the hours bled into the afternoon, the coastline began to recede. The green wall turned into a thin, dark ribbon. The water grew rougher. The waves in this region are short, steep, and relentless. By early afternoon, the swells began to break over the lashed canoes. The catamaran took on water. The heavy outboard motor, now a useless anchor, dragged the stern down. In a matter of minutes, the vessel capsized. Rockefeller and Wussing were thrown into the water. They managed to scramble onto the overturned hulls, clinging to the slick wood as the boat wallowed in the troughs of the waves. Most of their supplies, food, water, equipment, were lost to the deep. This marked the beginning of a harrowing night. The psychological toll of drifting in the open ocean in total darkness cannot be overstated. The Arafura Sea is not empty. It is teeming with life, much of it predatory. Saltwater crocodiles patrol the estuaries, and sharks, including tigers and hammerheads, are abundant in the deeper waters. Every splash, every brush against a submerged leg would have sent a jolt of primal terror through the men. According to Wussing's later testimony, the night was an eternity of cold and fear. They drifted further and further from the coast. The lights of the distant shore, likely fires from Asmat villages, flickered like taunting stars before vanishing completely. By dawn on November 18, the coastline was gone. They were alone in a 360-degree panorama of gray water and sky. The dynamic between the two men began to fracture under the strain. Rockefeller was young, physically fit, and possessed a hereditary confidence, a belief that situations could be willed into submission. He was not used to passivity. Wussing, older and perhaps more respectful of the ocean's indifference, advocated for staying with the boat. The hull was their only solid reality. It was buoyant. It was a target, however small, for search planes. Throughout the daylight hours of the 18th, they drifted. The sun in that part of the world is a physical weight, baking the skin and dehydrating the body rapidly. Thirst became a torture, but it was the drift itself that agitated Rockefeller the most. He calculated erroneously, as it turned out, that the current was pushing them parallel to the coast, or perhaps even back toward it, but very slowly. By the morning of November 19, nearly 48 hours after the engine failed, Michael Rockefeller reached his breaking point. The timeline here is precise, reconstructed from Wussing's delirious but consistent accounts. It was approximately 8:00 a.m. The sea was relatively calm, but the land was invisible. Rockefeller believed they had drifted south, perhaps closer to the island and river. He estimated the distance to shore to be 3, maybe 4 miles. In reality, later analysis of the currents suggests they were likely anywhere from 10 to 12 miles out. Rockefeller stood up on the slippery hull. He was stripping down to his underwear. He tied 2 empty gasoline jerry cans to his belt to serve as makeshift floats. He adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, without which he was severely nearsighted, and looked at Wussing. The conversation was brief. It was the dialogue of 2 men facing death, one choosing patience, the other choosing action. "I think I can make it," Rockefeller said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. Wussing protested. He pointed out the distance, the currents, the sharks. He urged Michael to wait. A search had to be underway. Rockefeller, however, was convinced that staying with the boat meant a slow death by exposure and dehydration. He possessed the physical stamina of a swimmer. He had been a trooper in the U.S. Army. He believed in his own body more than he believed in the chance of rescue. "I'm going," Michael said. With those words, the heir to the Standard Oil fortune slid into the water. He positioned the jerry cans under his chest, established a rhythm, and began to stroke toward the invisible horizon. Wussing watched him go. He watched the rhythmic splash of Michael's arms, the bobbing of the red jerry cans. He watched until Michael Rockefeller was nothing more than a disruption in the water's texture. And then, until he was nothing at all. Michael Rockefeller had just swum out of history and into myth. What followed for Renee Wussing was a descent into madness. Alone on the overturned hull, the isolation was total. The sun blistered his skin. The thirst became a physical agony. He began to hallucinate, seeing ships where there were only waves, hearing voices in the wind. But the machinery of the outside world had finally engaged. The disappearance of a Rockefeller was not a local administrative issue. It was a global event. Governor P.J. Platil of Dutch New Guinea had been notified. The search and rescue operation that launched was unprecedented in the region's history. Ships, airplanes, and helicopters were scrambled. The Dutch Navy, the police, and thousands of local villagers were mobilized. On the morning of November 20, 24 hours after Michael swam away, Wussing was spotted. A Dutch patrol aircraft, a Neptune, saw the glint of the overturned catamaran in the vast emptiness of the Arafura. Wussing was waving his shirt frantically. The pilot dropped a raft and supplies, but Wussing was too weak to retrieve them. He remained on the hull, hallucinating, terrified that the sharks he saw circling were coming to finish him. It wasn't until the following day, November 21, that a rescue boat finally pulled Renee Wussing from the water. He was sunburnt, dehydrated, and in shock. His first words to his rescuers were not of joy, but of a terrible, sinking realization. He asked if they had found Michael. They had not. The search that ensued was massive. It covered thousands of square miles of ocean and swamp. Rockefeller's father, Nelson Rockefeller, then the governor of New York, chartered a Boeing 707 and flew to New Guinea with Michael's twin sister, Mary. They brought with them a press corps that turned the sleepy outpost of Meroc into a media circus. They threw money and resources at the jungle, assuming, as Rockefellers do, that any problem could be solved with sufficient application of will and capital. But the Arafura Sea yielded nothing. No body, no shreds of clothing. Days turned into a week. The official narrative began to take shape. Michael Rockefeller, brave but foolish, had underestimated the distance. He had succumbed to exhaustion and drowned. Or darker still, he had been taken by a shark or a saltwater crocodile, a death by misadventure. However, a few days into the search, a singular discovery was made that complicated the drowning theory. 20 miles south of where the boat had capsized, caught in the roots of a mangrove tree near the shore, searchers found something. It was a gasoline jerry can. Shortly after, a second one was found. These were the cans Michael had tied to his belt. The implications were chilling. If Michael had drowned out at sea, the cans, still tied to his body, should have kept him afloat, or at least kept his body near the surface. If he had been eaten by a shark in deep water, the cans might have been severed, but they would likely be found drifting in the open ocean, not neatly lodged in the mangroves of the shoreline. The location of the cans suggested that Michael Rockefeller had not drowned miles from land. He had made it. He had crossed the 10 miles of open ocean, battled the treacherous currents, and reached the heavy, sucking mud of the Asmat coast. He had survived the incident at sea. But in reaching the shore, Michael Rockefeller had not found salvation. He had pulled himself out of the frying pan of the Arafura and into the fire of the Asmat swamp, specifically onto the shores of Ostjanep, a village with a fearsome reputation and a very recent, very bloody grievance against white outsiders. The incident of the boat was over. The mystery of the land was just beginning. End of segment. Project The Fifth Estate, GHOSDS of the ARAFURA segment. Part III, The Anomalies author. Journalist name date, October 24, 2023. Status, Draft 4. Fade in. INT. Studio dim lighting. A large monitor behind the host displays a map of West Papua, specifically the jagged coastline of the Arafura Sea. The water is depicted in dark, bruising blues. The coastline is a tangle of mangrove greens. Host direct to camera. To accept the official story of Michael Rockefeller's death is to accept a tragedy of simple physics. A man, an overturned catamaran, a 10-mile swim, and the unforgiving exhaustion of the sea. It is a clean ending. It is a logical ending. But in the Arafura Sea, logic is often the first casualty. When we peel back the layers of the official Dutch inquest and cross-reference them with the anthropological data of the era, the narrative of accidental drowning doesn't just fray, it snaps. We are left with a collection of anomalies, discrepancies in time, strange behaviors in the search parties, and physical artifacts that have no business existing if Michael Rockefeller simply sank beneath the waves. Cut to B-roll of the Arafura Sea. Murky, silty water. Mangrove roots twisting like arthritic fingers into the mud. The footage is grainy, perhaps archival 16. VOICOF host the first anomaly is the environment itself, or rather, the selective nature of its cruelty. Michael was a strong swimmer. He tied 2 empty gas cans to his waist for buoyancy. He told his companion, Renee Wussing, "I think I can make it." Host VO. When search teams scoured that stretch of water, they found nothing. No body, no scattered clothing. But more importantly, they never found the gas cans. Jerry cans don't drown. They don't get eaten by sharks. They drift. In a search operation funded by the boundless pockets of the Rockefeller family, involving ships, helicopters, and thousands of locals. The total disappearance of 2 bright red, buoyant objects is statistically bothering. Graphic, a timeline appears on screen. November 19, 1961. A marker flashes. Host then, there is the timeline of the Dutch colonial administration. We have to remember the geopolitical pressure cooker of 1961. The Dutch were desperate to show the world they were capable guardians of West Papua. Losing the son of one of the most powerful men in America was a diplomatic nightmare. On November 20th, a telegram was leaked from the Dutch government to the New York Times. It stated quite clearly that Michael Rockefeller had been found alive. Visual of the vintage telegram text overlays the screen. Michael, Rockfeller safe. Host Y. Why was this message sent? It was retracted hours later, dismissed as a rumor gone wrong. But in the world of diplomatic cables, mistakes of that magnitude are rare. It suggests that someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had information or a sighting that was hastily scrubbed. It created a fog of confusion that lasted for the critical first 48 hours of the search. INT, Archive Room Day. The host is wearing white cotton gloves, flipping through a stack of declassified Dutch patrol reports. They are yellowed, typed in a severe font. Host, but the most unsettling anomalies aren't found in the water. They are found on land, specifically in the Asmat village of Otsjanup. To understand why Otsjanup is an anomaly. You have to understand the concept of tit for tat. In 1961, the Asmat lived in a cosmos defined by balance. If a spirit is taken, a spirit must be replaced. 3 years prior to Michael's disappearance, in 1958, a Dutch colonial patrol, led by a man named Max Lapre, opened fire on the village of Oostjanup during a confrontation. Photo of Max Lapre appears. He looks stern, military. Host 5 high-ranking leaders of Oostjanup were killed. In the Asmat worldview, this left a cosmic debt. The spirits of those 5 men were restless, wandering the jungle, demanding balance. They needed heads, specifically the heads of white men Tuans, to quiet the ghosts of the leaders killed by white men. For 3 years, that debt remained unpaid. The village was a pressure cooker of spiritual anxiety. Host VO, enter Father Hubertus von Page, a Dutch missionary who lived among the Asmat, a man who spoke the language and understood the silence between words. Photo of Father VON PEIJ. He is gaunt, wearing spectacles, standing amidst Asmat warriors. Host walking through the archive. Weeks after the search was officially called off, Father Von Page began to hear things. Not official reports, but whispers in the smoke of the longhouses. Men from Oostjanup were seen acting strangely. They weren't mourning, they were celebrating. But they were celebrating in secret. In December of 1961, Von Page interrogated 4 men from the village. They told him a story that chills the blood. They claimed that a white man, exhausted but alive, had drifted to the mudflats near the darker tributaries of the shoreline. They said he was wearing black pants, Michael's swim trunks. They said he was weak. Host stops walking, looks at a document, and they said the warriors of Oostjanup didn't help him. They saw him not as a man, but as a gift, a bonanza sent by the spirits to pay the debt of 1958. This testimony was written down. It was sent to the Dutch authorities. And here is the anomaly. The report was buried. It was classified. The Dutch police inspector, Wim van de Waal, supposedly secured physical evidence, a pair of glasses and shorts allegedly traded from the village. Close up on a blurry, Xeroxed photo of a pair of thick-rimmed glasses lying on a woven mat. Host these glasses. Look closely. They are tortoiseshell prescription lenses, the exact style Michael wore. If Michael drowned miles offshore, how did his glasses end up in a warrior's hut? If he was taken by a crocodile, the other prevailing theory, the violence of such an attack would not leave a pair of spectacles neatly folded and preserved. The existence of the glasses implies arrival. It implies that Michael Rockefeller survived the swim. He touched the mud. He looked into the eyes of his rescuers, only to realize, too late, that he had swum into a funeral rite 3 years in the making. INT. Studio, the lighting shifts to a colder blue hue. Host sitting at the desk, but the rabbit hole goes deeper. We must talk about the Fraser anomaly. In 1969, 8 years after the disappearance, a journalist named Milt Matchlin traveled to the Asmat region to investigate the cold case. He didn't find Michael, but he sent a photographer, Malcolm Kirk, to capture footage of the local tribes. In one reel of 16 film, shot from a boat drifting past a group of Asmat canoes, there is a figure. The screen behind the host plays the infamous clip. It is grainy, shaky. A war canoe is filled with dark-skinned Asmat warriors, rowing rhythmically. But among them, on the far edge, is a naked man. Host frees it there. The video freezes. The resolution is poor, but the contrast is undeniable. Host, this man, is taller than the others. His posture is different. He is rowing, yes, but he looks wary, and most jarringly, he appears to be white, or at least significantly lighter-skinned than his counterparts. He has a beard. Anthropologists have argued over this few seconds of footage for decades. Is it a trick of the light? Is it an albino tribesman? Albinism does exist in the region, but usually comes with sensitivity to sunlight and skin lesions. This man looks tanned, weathered, but distinctly Caucasian. Host leaning forward. If the people of Otsjanup killed Michael in 1961, as the priest's report suggests, who is this man in 1969? This creates a bifurcation in the anomalies. Theory A: Michael was killed immediately, ritualistically harvested, and the white man in the footage is a coincidence or a genetic anomaly. Theory B: Michael wasn't killed. He was kept. In Asmat culture, captured enemies were sometimes adopted to replace the dead, stripped of their identity, and forced into the tribe. It's a concept known as social death. You are no longer you. You are the vessel of the person you replaced. Could Michael Rockefeller, the scion of American capitalism, have spent the 1960s rowing a canoe in the Arafura swamp, suffering from amnesia or trauma-induced dissociation? It sounds like fiction, but the footage exists. It is a ghost captured on celluloid. Sound: the low, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter rotor fades in. Host finally. There is the anomaly of the exit. Nelson Rockefeller, a man who did not give up, a man who could move mountains. He flew to New Guinea. He chartered a Boeing 707 to transport search gear. He was the definition of unrelenting. And then, abruptly, 10 days after the search began, he stopped. He looked at the jungle. He looked at the Dutch officials, and he declared his son dead by drowning. He packed up. He flew home. The family trust paid off the expenses, and a wall of silence was erected that has rarely been breached since. Host VOY. Host, did the Dutch officials take Nelson aside? Did they show him the report from Father Von Page? Did they show him the glasses? There is a theory that Nelson was told the truth. Your son wasn't just lost. He was consumed. And if you pursue this, if you send in the military to recover remains that may no longer exist, you will start a colonial war that will massacre these people and tarnish your son's memory forever. The anomaly here is the suddenness of the resignation. It suggests that the family didn't stop because they ran out of hope. They stopped because they were given a truth too grotesque to publicize. INT. Studio wide shot. Host, a missing jerry can. A retracted telegram. A pair of glasses in a hut. A white man in a canoe. And a father's sudden silence. These are not the footprints of a drowning. These are the jagged edges of a cover-up. Or perhaps a collision of cultures so violent that the truth was deemed too dangerous to survive. Michael Rockefeller swam out of the Western world and into something else entirely. The water didn't swallow him. The mystery did. Fade out. Text ON screen, Part IV, The Headhunter's Code. Project The Ghost of the ASMAT Part 3. The Dead Ends format. Audio script / podcast. Narrative author. Your name journalist persona. SOUNDBITE. The low, rhythmic thrumming of a heavy helicopter rotor. It sounds distant, muffled by humidity. Underneath, the sloshing of water against a wooden hull. A slow, humid drone fills the soundscape. Narrator, the Arafura Sea does not give up its secrets willingly. It is an expanse of shallow, silty soup, churning with the outflow of the island and river, teeming with saltwater crocodiles, and patrolled by sharks. But on November 20, 1961, the Arafura Sea became the stage for the most extensive manhunt in the history of the South Pacific. Michael Rockefeller was gone, and the world wanted him back. SOUNDBITE, teletype chatter, chaotic radio static, voices speaking Dutch and English overlapping. Narrator, when the news reached New York, the machinery of the Rockefeller Empire roared to life. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a geopolitical crisis involving one of the most powerful families on Earth. Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, future vice president, chartered a Boeing 707 and flew straight to Maroc. In the days that followed, the sky over New Guinea turned black with aircraft. The Dutch government, desperate to maintain their colonial grip on the region, deployed Marines, destroyers, and Neptune patrol aircraft. The Australians sent helicopters. Thousands of locals were mobilized to scour the mangrove swamps. They were looking for a 23-year-old heir in a pair of thick-rimmed glasses and swim trunks. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, in a world where the haystack is actively trying to digest you. Sondbite, the sound of heavy rain hitting broad leaves. A match being struck. Narrator, but here is where the story splinters. Here is where the investigation stops being a search for a man and starts becoming a study in deflection. We enter the corridor of dead ends. The first dead end is the official narrative. It is the story that was printed in the New York Times and filed away in the Dutch colonial archives. It is the story of the drowning. According to René Wissing, the Dutch anthropologist who was on the capsized catamaran with Michael, the two of them had drifted for 24 hours. They were roughly 10 to 12 miles from shore. Michael, impatient and confident in his physical fitness, strapped 2 empty jerry cans to his waist for buoyancy and said, "I think I can make it." He slipped into the water. He swam toward the faint green line of the mangroves. Wissing watched him go until he was nothing more than a dot in the waves. Sondbite, a slow heartbeat pulse, ambient underwater rumble. Narrator, the official logic was clean, simple, and tragic. 10 miles is a marathon swim, even with flotation. The currents in the Arafura are treacherous, capable of dragging a man miles off course in minutes. And then there are the predators. The Dutch authorities quickly leaned into this theory. He drowned, they said, or the sharks took him. It was a tidy conclusion. It absolved everyone of blame. It was a tragedy of nature, an act of God. Nelson Rockefeller, heartbroken and exhausted after 10 days of fruitless searching, accepted this. He returned to New York. The press pack dispersed. The case was closed. But for an investigative journalist, case closed is often a euphemism for stop looking. And when you look at the physical evidence of the search, the drowning theory begins to dissolve. Journalist, internal monologue tape recorder style. Note to self: check the title charts for November 19, 1961. The tide was incoming. It was pushing toward the shore, not away from it. Michael was a strong swimmer. He had flotation devices. He wasn't fighting the ocean. He was riding it. Narrator, the search teams didn't find a body. That in itself isn't proof of survival. The ocean is vast. But they did find the jerry cans. A few days after the disappearance, a search vessel recovered one of the red gasoline cans Michael had tied to his belt. Later, the second was found. They were located roughly 10 miles from where he started swimming. But crucially, they were found in the mud near the shoreline. Not drifting out at sea, near the shore. If Michael had drowned miles out or been taken by a shark in deep water, the cans, buoyant and tied to his body, would likely have drifted with the currents indefinitely. or been found still attached to remains. Finding them near the mangroves suggests something chilling. Michael Rockefeller made it. He reached the mud. The drowning theory is a dead end because the ocean didn't keep him. It spat him out. Sondbite, a shift in tone. The mechanical drone fades, replaced by the buzzing of insects and the distant, rhythmic beating of Tifa drums. Narrator, if the water didn't kill him, we have to look at the land. This leads us to the second dead end, the White King rumors. In the weeks and months following the disappearance, whispers began to trickle out of the jungle. Tales of a white man seen in remote villages. Sometimes he was a captive, held in a bamboo cage. Other times he was a Kurtz figure, a man who had gone native, stripped of his Western identity, living among the tribes. These stories were seductive. They played into the Western fantasy of the primitive. There were reports of a bearded white man in the village of Cannies. An Australian patrol officer claimed to have heard of a captive being traded between tribes. The media loved these stories. Even Michael's mother, Mary Todhunter Clark, clung to the hope that her son was alive, suffering from amnesia, lost in the green hell. But these were phantom leads. Every time an investigator chased a sighting, it evaporated. The white man turned out to be an albino villager, or a misinterpretation of a local myth. The White King theory was a dead end because it relied on Michael surviving. And in the Asmat region, in 1961, a lone outsider emerging from the sea, exhausted, defenseless, and spiritually charged, does not become a king. Sondbite, the sound of papers being shuffled, a heavy file slamming onto a desk. Narrator, so we are left with the most frustrating dead end of all, the bureaucratic wall. To understand why the truth about Michael Rockefeller was buried, you have to understand the politics of 1961. The Dutch were hanging onto Western New Guinea by a thread. The newly independent nation of Indonesia was threatening to invade, claiming the territory as their own. The Dutch argument to the United Nations was that they were civilizing the Papuans, preparing them for self-determination. They needed to show the world that the region was under control, that it was safe, that the rule of law existed. If the son of one of the most famous men in America washed up on shore and was immediately ritually slaughtered by headhunters, that narrative collapses. It would be a PR nightmare of global proportions. It would prove the Dutch had no control whatsoever. Journalist, the archives in The Hague tell a story of deliberate silence. We have telegrams from Governor Platiel, the highest authority in the region, ordering subordinates to stop discussing rumors of native crime. Narrator, 2 weeks after the search was called off, 2 Dutch priests, Father Hubertus van Page and Father Cornelius van Kessel, began hearing things. These men spoke the local dialects. They lived in the missions. They knew the rhythms of the Asmat. Men from the village of Otsjanup, a powerful, warrior-heavy community, were acting strange. There were ceremonies being held that shouldn't have been held. New artifacts were appearing. Father Van Kessel wrote a letter to his superiors. In it, he detailed a conversation with local men who claimed to have seen Michael. They claimed he reached the shore. They claimed he was alive when they found him. The priests sent these reports up the chain of command, and the chain of command strangled them. Soundbite, a sharp, high-pitched ringing tone that slowly fades into a low hum. Narrator, the police investigator, Wim van de Waal, was sent to the village of Otsjanup a month later. He wasn't sent to investigate a murder. He was sent to resolve a dispute about wood carvings. But while he was there, he saw things. He saw a pair of European swim trunks being worn by a young warrior, trunks that were too small for the man, trunks that matched the description of the ones Michael was wearing. He saw a pair of glasses that looked suspiciously like standard-issue American frames. Van de Waal dug deeper. He got names. He got a sequence of events. He compiled a report that essentially solved the mystery in 1962. He presented it to Governor Platiel. The governor told him to bury it. The file was marked secret. Van de Waal was transferred. The priests were told to stick to scripture. This dead end wasn't a lack of evidence. It was a surplus of inconvenience. The Dutch government decided that a drowned Rockefeller was a tragedy, but a murdered Rockefeller was a political liability. And so the official story remained. He drowned. Soundbite, the sound of water lapping against the shore. Heavy breathing. Narrator, these are the dead ends. The ocean that didn't take him. The rumors of a white king that never existed. And the government file that vanished into a vault in The Hague. For decades, this is where the story stopped. A question mark hanging over the jungle. But dead ends are rarely truly dead. They are just pauses. Because while the Dutch government could silence a police officer, and they could silence a priest, they could not silence the Asmat themselves. In the Asmat culture, the world is a balance. If you take a life, that spirit does not disappear. It lingers. It demands recognition. You cannot kill a man like Michael Rockefeller, a man of such immense power and mana, and simply forget about him. You have to name him. You have to carve him into the wood. You have to sing his death. The investigators left. The helicopters flew away. But the village of Otsjanup was left with a secret that was rotting them from the inside out. A secret that would wait 50 years to surface. The dead ends were just the beginning. Soundbite, a single loud crack of a drum, sharp cut to black silence. Segment title: The Lingering Signal Narrative Arc, The Disappearance of Michael Rockefeller. Word count: approx. 1,280. Audio fade in. The low, rhythmic thrum of an outboard motor struggling against water, followed by a sudden, sputtering silence. Underneath, the organic, wet sound of water lapping against a hollow hull. A subtle, low-frequency drone builds tension, not horror. Narrator: water has a memory, or so the poets say. But the Arafura Sea, that churning, silt-heavy soup separating the southern coast of New Guinea from Australia, doesn't remember. It consumes. It is a vast, indifferent expanse of tide and mud, where the fresh water of the Ismat swamps bleeds into the salt water of the ocean. It was here, on November 17, 1961, that the hierarchy of the modern world dissolved. Michael Rockefeller was 23 years old. He was the son of the governor of New York, the great-grandson of the richest man in modern history. He carried a name that could open doors in Manhattan boardrooms and command fleets of industry. But out here, 3 miles off the coast of the island and river mouth, the name Rockefeller held no buoyancy. Audio: the ambient sound shifts, wind picking up, the creaking of wood and rope. Narrator: he was traveling with Renee Wazing, a Dutch anthropologist. They were navigating a 40-foot catamaran, a pontoon boat cobbled together with local timber and ambition. It was an awkward vessel, heavy and unsuited for the erratic temperament of the Arafura tides. When the 18-horsepower engine flooded and died, the silence that followed must have been deafening. This is the beginning of the anomaly. This is where the signal begins to distort. In most disappearances, there is a clear demarcation between safety and danger. A fall from a cliff, a wrong turn in a cave. But for Rockefeller and Wazing, the danger was a slow-motion unraveling. They weren't immediately drowning, they were drifting. For 24 hours, the 2 men sat on the upturned hulls of their catamaran. Their 2 Ismat guides had already abandoned ship, swimming for shore to get help, a feat of endurance that would take them nearly a day to complete. But Michael and Renee stayed. They drifted through the night, the equatorial heat giving way to a chilling, damp darkness. We have to understand the psychology of this moment. Michael was not a fragile tourist. He was driven, arguably obsessed. He had spent months in the Ismat region, collecting the towering, intricate bisht poles, spirit poles carved to appease the ancestors. He had walked among the villages of Atsjanep and Amidsep. He was comfortable in the mud. He believed he understood the rhythm of this place. But looking at the coastline, a dark smudge of mangroves on the horizon, he saw a finish line that was slowly moving backward. Audio sound of a heavy splash. Then silence. Narrator. By the morning of November 19th, the boat had drifted roughly 12 miles offshore. The current was pushing them into the open ocean. Renee Wasing later recounted Michael's demeanor. He wasn't panicked. He was calculating. He was a young man in the prime of his life, a varsity swimmer at Harvard. He looked at the distance, estimated at the time to be anywhere from 3 to 10 miles, depending on the drift, and he did the math. "I think I can make it," he told Wasing. It is a sentence that haunts the historical record. It is the last confirmed transmission from Michael Rockefeller. He stripped down to his underwear. He tied 2 empty gasoline jerry cans to his belt to provide buoyancy. He adjusted his thick, black-framed glasses, without which he was nearly blind, and lowered himself into the water. Wasing watched him go. He watched the air to the Standard Oil fortune kick away from the capsized hull. A small, rhythmic splash moving toward the hostile green line of the jungle. He watched until Michael was just a dot, and then until he was nothing at all. Audio. A low, distorted radio static noise fades in, then cuts to the sound of a helicopter rotor whirring overhead. Narrator. What happens next is where the narrative fractures. It is where the official story and the lingering signal diverge. Less than 10 hours after Michael swam away, Renee Wasing was spotted by a Dutch naval patrol plane. He was rescued the next morning. The machinery of the Rockefeller family and the Dutch colonial government kicked into high gear immediately. Ships, airplanes, helicopters, thousands of man-hours were poured into scouring the Arafura Sea. They found nothing. No body, no jerry cans, no glasses. The official conclusion, filed after weeks of searching, was death by drowning. It is a logical conclusion. The tides in that region are violent. The Arafura Sea is teeming with saltwater crocodiles and sharks. Fatigue, hypothermia, or a predator could have easily taken him. But there were anomalies in the silence. If Michael had drowned, the jerry can's buoyant, red, impossible to miss, should have been found. They were tied to him. If a shark had taken him, the cans might have been severed, but they would still float. If he had succumbed to exhaustion, the cans would have kept his body near the surface, at least for a while. The ocean usually gives something back. Debris, clothing, something. In this case, the ocean was perfectly, suspiciously clean. Audio. The background sound changes. The ocean sounds are replaced by the hum of insects, the call of tropical birds, and the distant, rhythmic beating of drums. Jungle ambience. Narrator. So, let's follow the signal. Let's assume, for the sake of investigation, that the Harvard swimmer didn't drown. Let's assume he made it to the mud. If Michael Rockefeller reached the shore, he would have dragged himself out of the surf near the village of Otstjinup. He would have been exhausted, dehydrated, and vulnerable. Here lies the context that the newspapers of 1961 were too polite or too frightened to fully articulate. The Asmat region was not a passive backdrop. It was a complex geopolitical powder keg. 3 years prior, in 1958, a Dutch patrol leader named Max Lepre had ordered a raid on Otstjinup. It was a disciplinary action, a show of colonial force. In the chaos, several high-ranking Asmat men, war leaders, were shot and killed. In the Asmat cosmology, death demands balance. Violence is a reciprocal economy. When a spirit is taken, the universe is out of alignment until a spirit is taken in return. This is the concept of Safin, the spirit land, the realm across the sea. White men were often viewed as beings returning from Safin, ghostly and powerful, but not untouchable. The village of Otstjinup had been waiting. They were living in a spiritual deficit, owing a debt of blood to their ancestors because of the Dutch killings. Now imagine the scene. November 19, 1961. A white man, exhausted, emerges from the sea, the very direction of the spirit world. He is alone. He is helpless. To the Western mind, he is a distressed swimmer needing rescue. To the warrior culture of Otstjinup, still grieving their leaders, he may have looked like something else entirely. He may have looked like a gift. Audio, a low, resonant thud, like wood hitting hollow wood. Unsettling. Narrator, this is where the investigative trail turns cold and murky, obscured by the fog of colonial embarrassment and tribal secrecy. Shortly after the search was called off, strange reports began to filter out of the jungle. A Dutch missionary, Father Hubertus von Page, who spoke the local dialect and lived among the Asmat, began hearing whispers. Men from Otstjinup were telling stories in the men's longhouses. They spoke of a white man who came from the sea. They spoke of a confrontation at the riverbank. Von Page wrote letters. He contacted the Dutch authorities. He claimed that the villagers had described Michael's glasses perfectly. He claimed they described his underwear. He claimed that the jerry cans were not lost, but were kept as trophies. But these reports were stifled. Why? Because in 1961, the Dutch were fighting desperately to hold onto their claim of Western New Guinea. The world was watching. If it became known that the son of Nelson Rockefeller, one of the most powerful Americans alive, had not only drowned due to colonial negligence, but had been ritually killed and consumed by the very people the Dutch claimed to be civilizing, the geopolitical fallout would have been catastrophic. It was cleaner for Michael to drown. It was cleaner for the sea to take him than for the jungle to claim him. Audio, sound of shuffling papers, the click of a typewriter. Narrator, and so the file was closed. Presumed drowned. But the signal lingered. It lingered in the form of a private investigator sent by the Rockefeller family years later, who allegedly traded boat engines for skulls that were rumored to be Caucasian. It lingered in the photo taken by a journalist years later of a white man, naked and bearded, paddling a canoe with the Smat warriors, a photo often dismissed, yet hauntingly similar to Michael's profile. We look at the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, and we see a tragedy of hubris, a young man who thought his wealth and his education could insulate him from the primal realities of nature. But the deeper mystery isn't about whether he could swim 10 miles. We know he could. The mystery is what waited for him in the mangroves. The official story is a silence, a void. But if you listen to the whispers from Otstjinup, spanning decades, the story didn't end in the water. It ended on the mud bank, where two worlds collided in a spasm of violent reciprocity. Michael Rockefeller swam out of the history books and into a myth. And in the Asmat belief system, nothing is ever truly lost. It is only transformed. Energy is consumed and redistributed. Names are taken. The jerry cans were never found because they didn't sink. The glasses were never found because they didn't drift away. Audio. The jungle sounds fade out, replaced by the cold, rhythmic lapping of the ocean again. Narrator. When the search planes flew over Otstjinup in the days following the disappearance, the pilots reported seeing the villagers lighting huge fires and feasting. They assumed it was a coincidence, just another ceremony in a land of ceremonies. But down in the smoke, amidst the drums, the balance of the world was potentially being restored. Michael believed he could make it. The tragedy is that he was right. He made it to shore. He just didn't make it home. Audio fade to black.